G'day guys, Mac with the Outer Circle, and in today's episode we are talking getting started in Horus Heresy. So for those of you who are new to this channel, for several years now I've done the Getting Started in Horus Heresy series, and with the launch of the new edition, I brought out the Heresy 2.0 Getting Started series, and this is the latest video in that. What we're going to do today is talk about the legions themselves, who's good, who's bad, what their preferences are, some of the different styles of things like armor, and kind of the faux pas that people fall into with their armor patterns and such. By no means is it you must do things this way. Nothing is ever like that really in the hobby, but obviously this is sort of the approach that most Heresy players will take in the hobby, and therefore it's a good basis for you who might be interested in it, in what to do with your forces if you decide to build up and join the community. So, first off the bat here, the Loyalist Legionaries Astartes. Well, the Loyalists here are, in order, the Dark Angels, the White Scars, the Space Wolves, the Imperial Fists, the Blood Angels, the Iron Hands, the Ultramarines, the Salamanders, and the Raven Guard. Now, it's worth noting that of these legions, 3 of them, the White Scars, the Imperial Fists, and the Blood Angels, fight at the Siege of Terra, so they're the 3 that defend Earth at the very end of the Horus Heresy. Because of this and the setting of the game towards the end of the Horus Heresy, judging off the box set contents, the Imperial Fists are front and centre, and they, the White Scars and the Blood Angels, all have claim to fame for that. Now, out of the other legions, well, the Iron Hands, the Salamanders and the Raven Guard participate in the very opening battles of the Horus Heresy. They essentially get ambushed right at the start of the Horus Heresy by the Traitors. They think they're going in for an easy kill and end up getting stabbed in the back by their allies and very roundly annihilated. The combined strength of all 3 legions after that fight wouldn't even equal any of the smaller legions. That's how many troops they lost. I believe the Salamanders had something like 3,000 total survivors and the Raven Guard around 7. And many of those were only because they weren't present at the time of the battle. The Iron Hands had the most survivors, but even then they only had in the low tens of thousands of survivors. And considering that all of these legions had over 80,000 on average, that's a huge hit. For those who don't understand the setting, 80,000 Space Marines is a lot. Yes, legions like the Ultramarines had over 300,000 in their ranks at the time of the Horus Heresy, because in these days, Space Marine chapters weren't a thing. A Space Marine chapter, as you would recognise it in 40k, that's essentially a company, a smaller organisation within a legion, and a Space Marine chapter is just nothing in comparison to the size of them. Of the remaining legions, the Ultramarines end up trapped fighting the Wordbearers and the World Eaters for much of the Horus Heresy on their side of the Ruin Storm. So, for those who are familiar with the Cicatrix Maledictum in 40k, it's kind of like that. There's a big storm that goes through the centre of the galaxy and it stops people trapped on one side from getting to the other, and this greatly affects the Loyalists. And it involves most of the Dark Angels, the Ultramarines, and for quite a long time the Blood Angels. But the Blood Angels do manage to get to Terra. Lastly, the Space Wolves. The Space Wolves are on the other side of the Ruin Storm, the Terran side. However, due to their style of combat fighting, we'll say, they don't really participate in the Siege of Terra. They are there at the end to help relieve Terra, but they're not the kind of guys to fortify down and defend a bastion in the war. So they take the fight directly to Horus and fight much of their campaigns away from Terra against the Traitors for the Horus Heresy. The problem is, though, they got savagely mauled right at the beginning of the Heresy in the battles of Prospero and then in the Alaxes Nebula. So the Space Wolves don't get to contribute an awful lot to the Heresy because they are just so battered during the Heresy. It's because of things like this that when you go to 40k, the Ultramarines with their starting numbers of over 300,000, many of whom they lose, are able to retain more chapters versus, say, the Salamanders, who had, 3,000 Marines left after their first battle in the Heresy. They successfully argued that, hey, there's no point going to spare chapters for us because we don't have any to spare. So that's what happened in the Horus Heresy for them. So moving on from there, let's go to the Traitors. So in order here, we have the Emperor's Children, the Iron Warriors, the Night Lords, the World Eaters, the Death Guard, the Thousand Sons, the Sons of Horus, the Word Bearers, and the Alpha Legion. The Word Bearers get two colour schemes here, as they're really renowned for having the two going to the Heresy. Certain units had already swapped to the red colour scheme, but the grey colour scheme was still prevalent at the beginning of the Heresy and would transition throughout the course of events. So unlike others like, say, the Sons of Horus, who I could show the Lunar Wolves scheme for, it's really more important to show the Word Bearers in both their schemes. Now, out of the Traitors, the Thousand Sons spend probably the least amount of time fighting in the Horus Heresy. This is because the Thousand Sons took place... essentially, they lost their homeworld Prospero right at the beginning of the Heresy. They were Loyalists, however, they were attacked by Space Wolves who were tricked by Horus into attacking them in order to remove the potentially huge threat of the Psychic Legion from Horus. And in the end, the Thousand Sons turn around and side with Horus because of the treachery. It's a bit of a strange choice, but essentially they were outcast from the Imperium, and Horus was willing to take them on. Of the remaining legions, the Night Lords. Well, the Night Lords end up spending most of the Heresy fighting the Dark Angels on the wrong side of the Ruin Storm that I mentioned earlier. They're fighting them out in the far, far galactic east, in a place called Thramus, at the Thramus Crusade, and that takes up much of their time. I've done a whole video on that campaign if people are curious. The Alpha Legion conduct many, many covert ops, as that is their kind of style throughout the Heresy. And the Alpha Legion, they take place, they are involved in the Battle of Paramar right at the beginning of the Horus Heresy. They're also involved in the Isfahan Drop Site Massacre, the Alaxes Nebula, Chondax. They're really involved in many of those campaigns, and then they sort of fade away from the limelight. Not because of any inability, we'll say, on their behalf to fight. They're actually absolutely excellent combatants. But the Alpha Legion prefers to stick to their tried and true, tested methods of infiltration, subversion, intelligence gathering, that kind of thing. So they don't make a huge show throughout the Heresy, but that's really great because it means the world is your oyster when it comes to what you do with them. The Sons of Horus, of course, are leading most of the Horus Heresy, and alongside them you have the Iron Warriors and the Death Guard, who are prosecuting campaigns with them because, well, essentially those three legions are very clued on. The Iron Warriors are siege specialists and the Death Guard are attrition specialists. The two really get along well, you would think, because their tactics are very similar. But those three legions are not insane, we will say, compared to others, like the Emperor's Children, or the Night Lords, or the World Eaters. So those three legions are making up most of the gains of Horus's forces, whereas the World Eaters, who are insane close combat berserkers, who eventually become the Khorne Berserkers of 40k, they're hanging around with the Word Bearers and running around through Ultramarines territory and just destroying planet after planet. There is no real tactical goal to what they're doing, or overall strategic goal. They just like doing it. Then you have, last but not least, the Emperor's Children, who take place in a few battles at the earlier stages of the Heresy, like Isfahan 3, Isfahan 5, and then they spend much of the Heresy basically devolving heavily and quickly into chaos worship of Slanesh and excess, and forgetting all the troubles of the galaxy around them, only bothering to lift a finger when they absolutely have to, and even then, much of the time, only for the pleasure of it. They are often detached away from the Primarch, with forces like Eidolons, who's one of the higher-up commanders in the Legion. In fact, he's the second in command of the Legion. He takes about a third of the Emperor's Children and actually prosecutes a very successful campaign alongside the Death Guard of Mortarion as a subordinate to that Primarch against the White Scars. So that's our classic Traitors. So moving on from there, obviously we have our main types of power armor. This starter set is going to focus on the Mark 6 power armor, commonly known as the Beaky, but in-game as the Corvus pattern. That's our bottom right armor here, lovingly modelled by the Raven Guard, who had access to a lot of suits of this armor. Left of that we have Mark 5 or Heresy armor, modelled by an Alpha Legionnaire here. I've obviously chosen to showcase a range of different Legion iconography and colours here because it's interesting to see how the different Legions looked, and well, some of these Legions don't get much of a look in by people, and I really want to showcase them because I think they look really good. Now, the Mark V power armor on that Alpha Legionnaire, that's the sort of standard, quote-unquote, power armor of the time period throughout the Heresy. But Mark V power armor is not so much a standard type as it is cobbling together bits and pieces of all these other armors to make something functional when your armor is being battered and damaged, and the war and the demands of the war make it so that you cannot pick up easily replacements of full sets of armor. So you have to make do with what you've got. It's mismatched, it looks ugly, and I love it. It's one of my favourite marks of armor. On the top right, we have a World Eater, and he's modelling typical Mark IV power armor. And it looks nice. It's a very, very clean variant of it as well. Very little on iconography. I believe he's actually a relatively new inductee into the Legion, that particular artwork, if I remember reading it correctly. Left of that, top center, we have the Imperial Fist, who, this one here with a Raptor Imperialis, in fact, is what it's called. Symbol on his chest means he's actually a veteran of the Terran Wars of Unification. So before the Great Crusade even occurred, this Space Marine was alive and fighting alongside the Emperor on Terra. That's pretty cool. And last but not least, to the left of the Iron Armoured Marine, we have the Mark II Crusade pattern modelled by a White Scar. And as far as White Scars go, this is very, very basic looking armour. They go crazy on some of their designs, and it looks really cool as well. So these are the most common armours you're going to see. Now, rule of thumb is Mark II is incredibly common armour. It was everywhere, and as the Legion started to take a lot of casualties, old suits of Mark II will be pulled out of reserve armories to help clad new Space Marines. It's nowhere near as good as any of the armour that came afterwards. Mark III is a more specialised variant. It's basically Mark II, with extra armour plates bolted onto the front of it only. And you can see that in the backpack. You can kind of understand it when you look at the helmets and the knees. It's the same armour. And it gets very hot, it has reduced mobility, but the extra protection it affords is really useful, especially for things like breaches, heavy assault squads, where they can take more hits. Now, Mark IV Maximus, that World Eater armour, that was becoming more and more popular as the lead up to the Horus Heresy occurred, and it was rolling out very quickly across traitor forces. Horus was really pushing to get his armies into that armour, because Maximus pattern was basically the best armour that was available to the Astartes at the time. It hadn't fully rolled out by the time the Heresy occurred. Mark V, of course, is a stopgap armour type and was actually not going to be called Mark V or exist really in the first place. Mark V was originally going to be what we now know as Mark VI armour, but in the wake of the Horus Heresy it was classified as Mark VI armour, and that is the beaky armour. That had undergone prototype testing with the Salamanders, with the Iron Warriors, both of whom hated it, and Perturabo got it given to the Raven Guard, who, being the 19th Legion and relatively unknown and not very popular, he thought the project would die, but the Raven Guard reported huge success with the armour, and so the Imperium decided to put into full-scale production, so that by late in the Heresy, it's probably the most common mark of power armour. But that is to say, that is, in my opinion, late in the Heresy, and opinions will differ on that, but we won't go there. So these are some of the styles of armour I thought I would include, just to show you what Artificer armour can look like in that time period. So, on the left there we have an Ultramarine Centurion, and you can really catch the Roman vibes here, but don't worry, the Ultramarines in 30k are a lot cooler than they are in 40k. He has Mark IV Maximus pattern power armour, and it is just heavily stylised. It has a sort of Roman or Greco-Roman torso there with the sculpted on six-pack and lots of filigree, leather straps, and, well, it's just cool looking armour. In the centre we have a Mark III Night Lord's Legionnaire, and although his armour is basically just stock Mark III, the way that the paintwork is applied, the skull on the helmet painted on there, the different types of heraldry and banners, the blood, it's just an interesting colour scheme to see. And on the right, we have an Emperor's Children Centurion. This one here is modelling Mark IV power armor, but with, like the Ultramarine, a Legion-specific variant helmet. And again, looks pretty cool. Of course, much of this is recognisable as earlier armour, and I'll also note that while looking at it, that Emperor's Children Legionnaire has Oaths of Moment, not purity seals, attached to his armour. We'll talk about that later. Next up, we have Terminators. So the two main types of Terminators you're going to see are Cataphracti and Tartarus. Cataphracti are the two Terminators on the top left, Tartarus are the two Terminators on the top right, and the whole bottom row here is Tartarus. So, there are other patterns of power armor and Terminator armor around in this time period, namely Indomitus pattern Terminator armor and Gorgon pattern Terminator. Indomitus pattern is what the Terminators of Warhammer 40,000 wear. Now, the earliest suits of that are rolling out and they're being used by the Imperial Fist in this time period, but there's no real rules for them in the Horus Heresy. But if you used them, I definitely wouldn't complain. Then there's Gorgon pattern, which is essentially taking that power armor and the Primarch Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands Legion, modified it heavily in order to create a new and superior form of Terminator armor. And that's pretty cool as well. It looks kind of like Indomitus armor, but it has a lot of extra armor plates and chainmail and stuff. It's just cool looking. Now, like with previous images, I've chosen to show you a range of different legions here. So, top left, we have an Imperial Fist alternate colour scheme. This is more of a Templar Brethren related colour scheme or veteran company. Then we have a World Eaters Cataphracti, very basic compared to what you'll see on the next glyph. Then we have a Raven Guard Deliverer. This one here in Tartarus Terminator armor. Yes, they had Tartarus for the person who argued with me in the comments weeks back. Then we have an Emperor's Children Terminator. Next, a Sons of Horus Terminator on the bottom left. Another Imperial Fist Terminator, so you can see the difference in colour schemes between that veteran company of the Templar Brethren and a regular Imperial Fist Terminator. Next, we have a Salamanders Terminator who has a pretty cool Drake scale embossed shoulder pad with dragon's teeth hanging from a little belt on his waist. It's just really nice looking armour, and I don't see enough Salamanders in Heresy. And lastly, an Alpha Legion Terminator on the bottom right. So over here, we have some more of the crazy armor patterns. So top left, we have a Wordbearer's, I believe it's a Diabolist, not a regular Centurion. And yeah, he's summoning some demons, that guy. Next along, we have a Red Butcher. So think back to the previous World Eaters Terminator and compare it to this guy. This is what happens when your Terminators are so insane that they can't be kept safely on board your ship. So the power armor becomes or Terminator armor in this case, becomes a prison for them, and you chain them up inside their own armor between battles. Yeah, that sounds safe. A Space Wolves Huskal is next, with the large cloak, the spikes, the interesting Celtic patterns. Then, beside that, we have an Inner Circle Knight Cenobium of the Dark Angels Legion, who is a very, very busy boy compared to the other boys. Very Templar. Bottom left, we have a Grave Warden of the Death Guard, so he will have noxious fumes and poison and smoke billowing out of the pipes on his back. Next to that, we have a Death Shroud, also of the Death Guard, with a hand flamer built into his wrist. Normally they'll be armed with large power sides, and some of the coolest armor in the Horus Heresy in my opinion. After that we have two sets of Iron Hands Terminators, one in Cataphracti and one in Tartarus. The one in Cataphracti is extra cool because he has chainmail, and I'm really disappointed we don't have models for that because I really, really like that particular armor pattern. So, going on from there, we end up here, and that is with the things that aren't a go and are a go in the Horus Heresy. So top left, I mentioned Oaths of Moment earlier, but not Purity Seals. Purity Seals are something that comes with 40k territory. Oaths of Moment are essentially a promise a Marine makes before a battle that's affixed to his armour to remind him of that promise. and it is burned if they successfully complete the battle, and the oath is fulfilled. They burn the oath afterwards in a bit of a ceremony. A purity seal is not that. It is a religious symbolism piece. Right of that, we have a Deathwing symbol from 40k of the broken lion sword. Well, the lion sword isn't broken yet in 30k. That heraldry doesn't exist yet. So try to avoid things like that. Below that, we have the Aquila, and this is the blind Aquila. So one eagle can see, one eagle cannot. That's because of what it represents. The one head looking to the past, one to the future. The one looking to the future on the right is the Astronomicon eagle, and the Astronomicon is blind. And there's a bunch more lore that goes around with it, but suffice to say we'll call that the long-short version. Bottom left, we have the Crux Terminatus. Now, the Crux Terminatus is a popular icon used to mark out veteran sergeants and such in Warhammer 40,000, and Terminators earn the Crux Terminatus and wear it on their armour. And every Crux Terminatus contains a fragment of the Emperor's armour. Well, that's a bit of a problem in 30k, because if we go over to the right, the Emperor is still alive in Horus Heresy. Very much alive, and well, maybe not well. He's spending most of the Heresy on the Golden Throne, versus his, well, entombed Golden Throne 40k version. And because the Emperor is still alive, well, he's, one, not putting pieces of his armour inside inside Crux Terminatus. And the death cultism of 40k is not present yet. That is to say, all those skulls up the top. Yes, you'll see skulls in 30k. Why, the Emperor's Ultramarine in the bottom centre is rocking those little skulls on his wrists, on his vambraces of his armour. But that's very different to the absolute obsession that 40k has with the skull, because it represents the death of the Emperor and the death of the Imperium, and just death in general, kind of like how ancient, well, not ancient, but Middle-Age European artwork often depicted death and skulls, and because of things like the Black Death, and that constant reminder of what was around people. Well, it's the same thing here. The skull is not a super common motif. If a model has more than a few on them, it starts to look very 40k. And it's not to say you couldn't or shouldn't use those models, but merely just maybe choose the model that best represents the time period would be my advice. Now, the Crozius Arcanum. Yes, they exist in the Horus Heresy. Chaplains are a thing. But the Crozius is not just a power maul. It can be a power sword, a power axe. There are many options of Crozius open to you in the Horus Heresy, and especially if you choose to use Legion-specific war gear or items. But do remember that the chaplains of 30k are not wearing skull-faced helmets, because they are not wearing the Mask of Death. That's not to say you can't give them skull-faced helmets as a rule of cool, but don't get obsessed with the chaplain being in black armour, because that is representative, almost in a religious way, of the Emperor's sacrifice, and the chaplains embody that spirit and that religious zeal in 40k, and that has not yet come to pass. The chaplains in this time period wear the same stuff as the Marines around them, but the Crozius is their badge of honour and their badge of office, and they do not have a Rosarius in this time. Lastly, of course, top centre, no Primaris Marines. Just no, don't ask, it's not a thing in the Horus Heresy. So if you didn't see your favourite chapter or whatever force from 40k represented in the previous pictures, this should tell you why. There is 18 legions participating in this. Of course, there is Mechanicum and many others, but the Primaris Marines are not among them. Next, of course, and an important one, the Codex compliant force. Codex compliant chapters do not exist in 30k. What does exist is the Space Marine Legion Astartes Bellicosa Princeps. Essentially, what makes up one of those chapters makes up pretty much a company underneath a battalion, underneath a chapter, underneath the overall command of the Legion within the Horus Heresy. That is how big the scope of 30k is. So there you go. That's it from me today. Hopefully this is informative to those of you who are thinking of dipping your fingers into the Horus Heresy, and I strongly encourage you to. It's a fantastic system with an awesome community who is full of awesome painting and great hobbyist advice. Do remember that some people can get carried away with how into it they are. I know I can to an extent, but it is all meant to just be in good fun. There's 18 legions to pick from, with dozens of different colour schemes and cool things you can do with them. And as long as you pay some attention to the background here and do a little reading up, you'll go a long way in it. Anyone who's watching this is more than capable of it. I have faith in you. Anyway, that's all from me for now. I will continue doing Getting Started in 2.0 videos going forward, and I hope you can all join me for them. I'm Mac with the Outer Circle. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all on the next one.